I folded the napkin in my lap very slowly, the way you do when your hands need something to hold on to so they don't shake. My son was standing at the head of the table, in my father's dining room, the same dining room where I had eaten thousands of meals as a child, where my father had sat at the head for 61 years, and he was looking at me like I was a stranger who had wandered in off the street. "Mom," he said. And the way he said it wasn't soft the way a son says it. It was the way you correct someone. You really need to stop making everything about money. My daughter-in-law didn't look up from her phone. She was sitting right beside him, and the corner of her mouth pulled up just slightly. Not a smile exactly, more like satisfaction. I looked around the table. My aunt, my two cousins, my father's oldest friend, Harold, who had driven 4 hours to be there. They were all watching me. We had buried my father 6 hours ago. His reading glasses were still on the kitchen counter. His cardigan was still hanging on the hook by the back door. And my son had just told me I made everything about money. I said nothing. I took a sip of water. I set the glass down carefully, and I smiled, not because anything was funny. I smiled because I had just made a decision, and once I make a decision, I feel a strange kind of peace. 62 years old, and I was only just learning that about myself. Let me tell you how we got to that table. My husband passed when my son was 11. A heart attack, sudden, no warning. One morning he kissed me goodbye at the door, and that was the last morning. After that it was just the two of us, my son and me, in a house that suddenly felt 3 sizes too large. I went back to nursing full-time. I worked nights when I had to. I drove him to every soccer practice, every debate tournament, every college visit. I was not a perfect mother, I don't think there is such a thing, but I was a present one. I was there. My son was bright, genuinely bright, not just mother-proud bright. He tested into the gifted program. He got a partial scholarship to a good university. He graduated law school with honors. I cried at every ceremony, every single one, with the same tears I had been saving since his father missed the first one. He met his wife during his 2nd year of practice at a mid-size firm downtown. She came from a family with money, real money, the kind that has always been there and never thinks about itself. Her father owned commercial real estate. Her mother sat on 2 non-profit boards. They were not unkind people, exactly. They were just people who had never needed anything. And that creates a particular kind of blindness. The wedding was beautiful. I paid for part of it not because anyone asked me to, but because I wanted to, and because my son looked nervous about the cost, and I couldn't stand to see that look on his face. That was the first mistake. Not the paying, the not talking about it. I just quietly wrote the check and handed it to him and said, "Don't worry about it," and watched the tension leave his shoulders and felt like I had done something good. That feeling would cost me a great deal over the next 3 years. 8 months after the wedding, my son called me on a Tuesday evening. He wanted to start his own practice. He had a plan, a real one. He'd found office space. He'd already approached 2 potential clients. He had a partner lined up. What he needed was capital to cover the first 18 months. Rent, equipment, malpractice insurance, a part-time paralegal. He had done the math. He needed $47,000. I want you to understand something about that number. I was a registered nurse for 31 years. I was good at my job and I worked hard, but nurses are not wealthy. What I had in savings was what I had spent decades putting away, dollar by dollar, with discipline. When my parents passed my mother first, then my father 2 years later, they left me the house I grew up in. A modest house in a modest neighborhood, but paid off and worth something by then. I sold it and put the money away. That was my cushion. That was my retirement supplement. When my son called me on that Tuesday, I had $51,000 in that account. I gave him $47,000. I did not give him a loan agreement. I did not ask for repayment terms. I told myself it was an investment in his future, which was also my future. Because when your only child succeeds, you succeed too. That is the quiet math of parenthood that no one writes down but everyone believes. I kept working. I wasn't ready to fully retire anyway, and honestly the extra income steadied me. I picked up weekend shifts. I told myself everything was fine. The practice grew. Slowly at first, then faster. Within 18 months, my son had 3 associates working under him. Within 2 years, he had moved to larger offices on a better street. I would drive past sometimes just to see his name on the door. Daniel, my son. I had gotten him there. His wife had quit her marketing job by then. She said she was going to start a lifestyle brand, something about wellness and interior design. I never saw much come of it, but she seemed busy, and my son seemed happy, and I told myself that was enough. They bought a house, a large one, in a neighborhood where the elementary schools have waiting lists. I helped with that too, not with the down payment that they managed, but with things around the edges, new appliances when theirs broke, the deposit on a storage unit when they were renovating, groceries dropped off without announcement when I knew things were tight between invoices, the kind of help that never shows up on a ledger because it arrives quietly through the back door. I never mentioned it. That was the second mistake. Silence, I have learned, is not the same as generosity. Silence just means the other person never has to account for what they receive. My father's health declined over the winter. He was 84, and he had lived well and stubbornly. But by February, he needed help with things he had never needed help with before. I took a leave of absence from work and moved into his house for 6 weeks. I cooked for him, drove him to appointments, managed his medications, sat with him in the evenings while he watched the news and fell asleep in his chair. My son visited twice in those 6 weeks. Both times his wife did not come. Both times the visit lasted under 2 hours. My father passed on a Thursday in April, quietly, in his own bed, the way he had always said he wanted to go. I held his hand. I was the only one there. The funeral was on a Sunday. My son drove up Saturday evening. His wife arrived separately on Sunday morning, 90 minutes before the service, in a car I hadn't seen before, new, expensive, the kind with a nameplate I recognized from advertisements. I didn't ask about it. It wasn't the day. The service was short and beautiful. Harold gave a eulogy that made everyone laugh and then cry in the same paragraph. My father had that effect on people. He was plain-spoken and funny and loyal, and the room felt his absence like a pressure change in the air. Afterward, back at the house, my aunt had arranged food. People sat and ate and told stories. It was the right kind of afternoon for a grief, warm and slow and full of memories. That was when my son made his announcement. He stood up at the table. I still don't fully understand why he stood up. It wasn't that kind of room, and he said that he and his wife had some news they wanted to share, and that he hoped Grandpa would have been happy to hear it. They were expecting their first child. I want to be honest. My first feeling was joy, pure and immediate. For 1 full second, I felt nothing but joy. Then his wife said, with that particular smile of hers, that they were going to need to think seriously about space and about finances, and that they were hoping family would step up and be supportive in real ways, not just emotional ones. She said real ways. At my father's funeral table, 6 hours after we put him in the ground, my aunt looked at her plate. Harold coughed. My cousin studied something fascinating on the far wall. I said, gently, that this was wonderful news, and we could talk about all of that later. My daughter-in-law said, with the same smile, that she just thought it was important to be direct, since in her experience, vague conversations led to misunderstandings. My son nodded. I said, still gently, that I understood, and that I had always tried to be there for my son. That was when he said it. Mom, you really need to stop making everything about money. I had not mentioned money, not once. He said it like I had been doing something wrong, like I had just presented him with an invoice over the bread basket, like the previous 3 years, the $47,000, the appliances, the groceries, the deposit, the Saturday phone calls when the firm was struggling, the 6 weeks I spent watching his grandfather so that he could stay home and build his practice, like all of it had just made me tiresome. You've always had a martyr complex about the things you do for people, his wife said, not looking up from her phone. It's exhausting for everyone. I folded my napkin. I took a sip of water. I set the glass down, and I smiled, because I had just made a decision. That evening, my son and his wife drove back to the city. Before he left, he hugged me in the way you hug someone you're slightly annoyed with, brief, one-armed, already moving toward the door. His wife waved from the car without getting out. I stayed at my father's house that night. I had arranged to stay for a week to handle the estate paperwork, and my childhood friend Carol, who lived 4 blocks away, had told me to call her if I needed anything at all. Carol had known me since we were 7. She had known my father. She cried harder at the funeral than anyone except me. I sat at my father's kitchen table for a long time, after everyone left, with his reading glasses still on the counter and his cardigan still on the hook, and I thought about what I had built and what I had allowed. Then I took out my phone and I started making calls. The first call was to my financial advisor. I told her I needed to move some accounts and restructure a few arrangements. She asked if everything was okay. I said yes. I said I was just getting my house in order. The second call was to the bank. I had a line of credit tied to my son's firm, not large, but it was there. A backstop I had co-signed 2 years ago when the firm was expanding and needed a short-term cushion. I began the process of withdrawing my name from that agreement. The third call was to myself. Not literally. I sat quietly in my father's kitchen, and I told myself the truth, which was this. I had spent 3 years making myself indispensable and invisible at the same time, and those two things cannot coexist for long. You cannot be someone's foundation and also be someone they look through. Eventually the house shifts, and you find out what it was built on. I slept better that night than I had in months. The next morning, Carol came over and we had coffee and I told her everything. Not just the table, not just his wife's comment, but all of it, the $47,000, the appliances, the 6 weeks with my father that my son had sent flowers for, but not himself. Carol listened without interrupting, which is one of her great gifts. When I finished, she set down her mug and she said, "What are you going to do?" I told her I was going to stop, not out of anger, not as a punishment, though I understand how it might look like one from the outside. I was going to stop because what I had been doing had not helped my son. It had insulated him from the natural weight of his own choices, and a man who never carries weight doesn't build the muscles he needs, and those muscles are what I was supposed to be giving him all along. I had not given him money. I had given him a delay. That realization didn't make me sad. It made me clear. I spent the rest of that week at my father's house going through papers, sorting his belongings, calling the attorney about the estate. My son called once to check in. The call was 4 minutes long. I didn't mention anything about what I had done with the bank. I asked about the baby. He said everything was good. I said I was glad. We said goodbye. 2 weeks later, I got a text from my son that said, "Mom, there's some issue with the firm's credit line. Bank says your name was removed. Can you call me?" I called him. "Yes," I said. "I removed my name." There was a pause. "Why would you do that?" he said. "We rely on that." "I know," I said. "Mom, we're having a baby. This is not a good time to be making changes like this. I understand that it's not convenient," I said, "but I've also realized that I've been a co-signer on an account for a firm that made $500,000 last year. And I did that because 2 years ago you needed a cushion, and the cushion became a floor, and the floor became an assumption. I'm 62 years old. I can't be an assumption." He said he couldn't believe this. He said I was being selfish. He said that I had always done things to make myself feel important, and now I was doing it again. I let him finish. Then I said, "I love you. I want you to be successful. And I think the most loving thing I can do right now is to let your success be entirely yours." He hung up. The weeks that followed were not quiet. My daughter-in-law called twice. The first call was controlled, logical. She explained their financial planning and how my withdrawal had created complications, and she used phrases like family obligation and this is not how it works. I listened politely and said I was sorry for any inconvenience and that I was confident they would work it out. The second call was less controlled. She told me that I had always been jealous of her family, of everything they had built. She told me I had used money to try to control my son, and now that my control was gone, I was punishing him. She told me that her mother had warned her about me before the wedding, and that she should have listened. I let her finish too. Then I said, "I'm going to end this call now. I hope you and the baby are healthy." She said one more thing before I hung up. She said, "You'll regret this when your grandchild doesn't know who you are." I sat with that one for a while. I won't pretend it didn't hurt. It did. That kind of threat lands differently when it's a child being used as a weapon. But I also knew that threats made in anger are a different thing from intentions, and that the future has a way of rearranging itself in ways nobody plans for. I went back to work. Not full-time, I had decided I was genuinely ready to step back, but I picked up consulting shifts at a clinic 2 days a week, which I liked. I started going to a grief support group at my church for people who had recently lost parents. That was not something I would have done before. The old me would have said I was fine. I was managing. I didn't need a group. The new me showed up on a Tuesday evening with a box of tissues and sat in a circle of strangers and cried for the first time since my father's funeral. And it was one of the most useful things I had ever done. In May, I went on a trip I had been postponing for 9 years. My college roommate lived in Portugal now, had for 20 years, and every year she asked me to come visit, and every year I had a reason why I couldn't. This year, I bought the ticket before I could think of a reason. I was gone for 11 days. I walked a lot. I ate good food. I sat at outdoor cafes in the afternoon and read books. I called Carol twice. I did not call my son. He called me on day 8. The call was different from the previous ones. His voice was quieter. He said he had been thinking, and he wanted to talk. Not about the credit line, about other things. I told him I was in Portugal. There was a long pause. Then he said, "You're in Portugal?" "Yes," I said. "Alone?" "With my friend. She lives here." Another pause. "I didn't know you were planning a trip." "I've been planning it for 9 years," I said. "I just kept putting it off." I could hear something shifting on the other end of the line. Not an argument waiting to happen. Something else. Something younger. "Are you okay, Mom?" he asked. "I'm wonderful," I said. And I meant it. I came home in June. My son asked if he could come visit. Not his wife, just him. He drove up on a Saturday, and we sat on my back porch and drank iced tea, and he was quiet for a long time before he spoke. He said he'd done a lot of thinking. He said he knew he had handled the last several years badly, that he had let things happen that he should have spoken up about, that he had allowed his wife to speak to me in ways that were not acceptable, and he had told himself it wasn't his place to intervene between us, which was cowardly, and he knew that now. He said, "I didn't think about what you actually gave us. I just got used to it being there." I nodded. "How much was it?" he asked. "The total. I've been trying to figure it out, and I can't get the number right." I had the number right. I had always had it right, not because I was keeping score, but because I am a woman who was raised to know where every dollar went, and numbers like that don't leave you, I told him. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, he put his head in his hands. "Mom," he said, "I'm not telling you so you can feel guilty," I said. "I'm telling you because you asked, and because the truth is a better foundation than the version of events where I was just quietly there, invisible and inexhaustible." He looked up. His eyes were red. "I want to make it right," he said. "That's not what I want," I said. "I don't want the money back. I want you to be a man who understands the weight of what people do for him. I want you to raise your child knowing that love is not a credit line. I want you to teach your son or daughter what I should have taught you when you were 16, that self-sufficiency is not a punishment. It is a gift." He sat with that. After a while, he said his wife had been wrong to say what she said about the grandchild. He said that would not happen. He said he was sorry. I told him I appreciated that. I told him I loved him. I told him that the door to a real relationship with me was always open, but that the door to the previous arrangement was closed. And those were 2 different doors, and it was important to know which one he was walking through. He hugged me before he left. Both arms this time, and for long enough to mean it. I don't tell you this story to make myself a hero of it. I made choices over many years that I have had to examine honestly, and some of them I'm not proud of. I gave without speaking, which is its own kind of manipulation. When you don't tell someone what you're doing, you're also not letting them refuse it, and that takes something away from them. I created a dependency by being too afraid of what independence might look like. I confused sacrifice with love, and they are not the same thing. What I know now, at 62, sitting in a house that is mine and a life that is finally mine, is this. There is a difference between support and substitution. Support helps someone build the thing they're building. Substitution just builds it for them and calls it love. My father knew that. He had not given me a comfortable life. He had given me the skills to make one. When he passed, he left me a small inheritance. But what I carry every day is not the money. It's the memory of him sitting across the kitchen table when I was 19 and newly certain I knew everything, and saying to me, very calmly, "Nobody owes you a soft landing, Margaret, but you can always build one." I should have said that to my son when he was 19. I'm saying it now. 20 years late is not the same as never. His daughter was born in October. 7 pounds, 4 ounces, dark hair, loud. He called me from the hospital, and his voice was the voice of a different man, cracked open and soft in a way I hadn't heard since he was small. He asked if I wanted to come. I drove 3 hours that night. I held her in the hallway outside the room, wrapped in that thin hospital blanket, impossibly light and impossibly solid at the same time. She had his eyes, or maybe every baby has those eyes, the ones that haven't learned to be guarded yet. My daughter-in-law was in the bed, tired and pale and more human than I had ever seen her. She looked at me holding her daughter, and she said, quietly, "Thank you for coming." I said, "Of course, that is where we are. Not at the end of a story, at the beginning of a different one. One where the terms are honest and the love is not disguised as a bank transfer. One where I know what I'm giving and they know what they're receiving, and neither of us pretends that it's free." I think my father would have approved. I went home that Sunday morning, just as the sun was coming up over the highway. I stopped at a diner I had never been to before, and I ordered eggs and coffee, and I sat by the window and watched the parking lot fill up with Sunday morning people, couples, families, a man my age reading a newspaper the old way, folded in quarters. I thought about what I had done and what I had let go of and what I had kept. I thought about a napkin folded carefully in my lap at a table where I should have been grieving and was instead being told I was tiresome. I thought about a smile that wasn't happy and wasn't angry. Just decided. I left a good tip. I got in my car. I drove home. The cardigan is still on the hook by my back door. I put it there myself, the week I finally cleared out my father's house. I see it every morning when I leave. I think about what it cost to become someone he would recognize. I think it was worth every dollar.